Today, I'll show you how to transform this pile of scrap wood into stylish domino and card trays that will wow your guests at your next game night. If you're like me, you probably have tons of scrap sitting around. Some people would say I'm a hoarder. Personally, I like to call it being prepared for when I might need that 3 inches off that piece of wood I tested on the CNC. I mean, it has sentimental value, right? All right, I'll get rid of it. To get started, we're looking for scrap that is roughly 3/4 of an inch thick, at least 12 inches long, and at least 5 inches wide. The number of scraps you'll need will depend on how many trays you want. You can get away with 4 trays, but I personally like to make 6, just so that I have a few extras laying around. If your pieces are like mine, you probably need to do some rough cutting in order to be able to work with them. We're going to cut these pieces to our final width of 5 inches because that's important for the next step, but we're not going to cut them to our final length yet. Here's a tip. I use blue painter's tape where I'm going to cut just to help prevent some of the splintering of the wood. Lengthwise, I'm going to shoot for between 12.5 and 13 inches. I want to leave these a little longer just in case we get blowout or splintering while cutting the channels. If your boards are right at 12 inches and you don't have any extra to work with, one of the things you can do to help minimize the blowout is use an extra piece of wood behind your tray while you're cutting it, and that will help with the splintering as the saw blade comes out of the back of the wood. The channel that holds the cards is a straightforward single blade width cut. I happen to have a thin curved blade, but a normal blade will work just fine as long as the channel is deep enough. Measure the thickness of all your pieces, writing down each measurement. To figure out the depth of our card channels, we want to subtract 1/4 of an inch from our thinnest measurement. I have several scraps that are 23/32 of an inch thick. After some math, I rounded my cut to be 7/16 of an inch deep. Through some trial and error, I figured out 75 degrees seems to be the perfect angle for both the cards and the dominoes. To measure the blade angle, I'm partial to this digital angle gauge that I got off Amazon for around 20 or 30 bucks. But most saws have some kind of built-in way to measure the angle of your blade as you're adjusting. First, I set my angle gauge on the table and zero it out to make sure I'm measuring my blade angle relative to the surface of my table. Let's set our blade angle to 75 degrees. Now that we have the right angle, let's set the blade height to the 7/16 that we calculated earlier. I use this little gauge that I use for my router table, but you can use a square, a ruler, a tape measure, whatever you have that you can easily read while adjusting your blade height. Just to give us some peace of mind, let's do a test cut on some scraps to make sure that we have our blade height and angle set just right. Checking out our test cut, it looks like we're 1/4 of an inch from the bottom and the card sits nicely in the channel. So I think we're ready to start cutting our trays. We're going to want 4 sets of channels running the full length of our trays. Here are the measurements I'm going to set my fence to for each pass. I know they're not perfectly spaced, but it's close enough they're not noticeable. But if that's going to bother you, go do some math and we'll be waiting for you when you get back. I like to make minimal changes to my fence settings while I'm cutting, so I'll try and cut as many things as that setting as I can before I move on. Let's cut the first channel for each tray. Now we're going to cut all the channels at the second setting, then we're going to cut all the channels at the third setting, and then we'll finish with all the channels at the fourth setting. Now that we have the card channels cut, throw some cards in there and give yourself a pat on the back. We need to measure the thickness of our dominoes to determine our channel width. This is future me saying do not skip this step, because I learned even within the same set, there are even differences in thickness. So the first time I went to use the trays, not all the dominoes fit. My dominoes are 19/64 thick, which I rounded to 5/16 for my channel width. Like most things in woodworking, there's multiple ways to cut these channels. One method is to mark a stopping point and then remove everything from the card channel over one saw blade width at a time until you have cut the full channel width. Another option is to use a set of dado blades, which is essentially stacking multiple blades on top of each other to create one thick blade and cut more away in a single pass. My dado blades came with a chart, so I can easily look up and see I need 5/16 of width, and that will tell me what blades I need to install on my saw. Once you get the blades installed, just like with the single blade setup, let's double check our blade angle is still 75 degrees. When choosing a blade height, we don't want to cut our domino channel too deep because it would cover up the dots or the numbers. So I decided to set my blade height to a quarter of an inch. Like they say, measure twice, cut once. So let's do another test cut on some scrap with our blades installed to ensure the gap is wide enough to allow the dominoes to easily slide in while still holding them upright and not allowing them to get bumped out. If you're happy with the fit, then it's time to cut the channels on the trays. Here are the numbers for where I'm going to make my 4 cuts. The way I arrived at these was by eyeballing the edge of the dado blade with the edge of the channel I'd cut for the cards and writing that number down for future use. Yes, I could have done math to figure these out, but let me ask you, where's the fun in that? You know the drill at this point. We're going to cut all our first channels, then change our fence and cut all our second channels, then our third, and then our fourth. It's the same thing you did earlier, just now with a wider blade. Once you've cut all the channels, it's time to cut the trays to their final length of 12 inches. Inspect the ends of your trays for any blowout that happened, either from the saw blade or the dado blades. If you had some on both ends, cut a little from each end to arrive at our final length of 12 inches. Don't forget the tip earlier that you can add blue tape to help with the potential blowout, but it might be hard to get in those little channels, so I'm not totally sure it's worth it. Once you've got all the trays cut to the final length of 12 inches, we can start to work on the finishing. Okay, I'm going to keep it real. I'm not going to lie to you. Sanding is probably the most painful part of this process. One might go so far as to call it tedious. Unfortunately, with all the nooks and crannies we've created, I feel like the best way to do the sanding is by hand. In my case, some of my plywood has a very thin top veneer layer that I don't want to sand through, so I don't want to take a power tool to any of this. Trust me, your hands will not thank me later. I like to start with a low grit, like 150 or maybe even 60, depending on how rough the channels look. For the card channel, I just double the paper over and run it back and forth a few times. For the domino channel, I have a thick piece of rubber that I wrap the paper around, but you can use whatever you have available that'll help you get down in the channel. Again, I'm not going for perfection or perfectly smooth. I'm just trying to soften some of the roughest areas. Now we're going to do the same using 220 grit sandpaper. 220 is also the first grit that I use on the outside surface of the trays. For sanding the larger flat areas, I have some 220 on a sanding block, but if you don't have a sanding block, you can also wrap the paper around a piece of scrap wood. I also hit all the edges and corners with 220 just to soften those up a bit. Now we're going to wash, rinse, and repeat with the 400 grit sandpaper with a slight variation at the end. If you're going to put any type of liquid finish on these, we want to take out some insurance to help make sure we get the best finish possible. Once you finish your first pass with 400 grit sandpaper, you want to wet a rag and wipe down all the surfaces. This will cause the grain to raise so that we can sand it again with the 400 grit paper, which should minimize the grain raising effect, which may happen when applying a liquid finish. Once everything is dry and has had its last sanding pass, we need to remove as much dust as possible. You can vacuum the surface if you have a shop vac, or just use a dry cloth to brush it off. I'm going to use a high gloss polyurethane, which is easy to work with, but also offers easy cleanup with just soap and water. I'm going to use a bristle brush to apply the finish down in all the crevices and use the sponge brush for the flat surfaces with the hope of minimizing brush strokes. Before we apply our finish, let's do some area prep to make for easy cleanup later. Yes, this piece of brown paper has seen better days, but it still works, so why get rid of it? Just a quick tip, I face the curls of the paper down so it curls into the table and not into the stuff I'm working on. I'll admit, my first coat tends to be pretty sloppy because I'm trying to get the finish down in all the little cracks and crevices. My biggest caution or word of warning would be to leave yourself plenty of room to work and not overcrowd your workspace. You're going to have drips, but take the time to clean them up while they're wet because it will save you a world of pain later. This polyurethane needs to dry 2 hours before recoats, so why don't we set a timer and check out some cat photos. I've applied a couple of coats now, and things are looking good. I just have a couple of spots that I need to clean up. For any drips that I missed, I used an X-Acto blade to try and remove the bulk of it, finishing with some light sanding. Even with all the prep earlier, I noticed I can still feel some stubble where the grain raised. Hit everything very lightly with some 400 grit sandpaper because you don't want to remove the layers of finish you've already applied. By doing this, you'll ensure the last coat goes on silky smooth. For the polyurethane, you're supposed to let it dry at least a few days before normal use. But thanks to the time traveling abilities of video editing, we get to jump right to the finished product. Roll that beautiful footage. I love the way these trays came out. That high gloss finish is beautiful, and it really makes the wood grain pop. At this point, I've made over a dozen of these, and everybody loves them. And I love explaining to everyone that these are really just made with scraps I had sitting around the shop, so the only investment was my time. I hope you all enjoyed the project, and let me know down in the comments about a project you may have done to level up your game nights. Oh, and one more thing. You didn't think I would throw away a perfectly good piece of plywood, did you?